much of the last 2 years thinking about how the world can avert 10 million people dying every year from antimicrobial resistance by 2050. So honestly, exploring self-destruction by superintelligence was really quite a welcome diversion. As a Brit, my national pride bristled somewhat at the notion of only American leadership being the realistic pathway to avert the self-destruction risks of superintelligence. But the assertion does carry weight if it's met with a broad and nuanced understanding. The US has the ability to convene international alliances and guide global conversations, similar to the leadership it demonstrated in the early atomic age. However, this isn't the Cold War, and superintelligence isn't the atomic bomb. The complexity of superintelligence spans borders and involves the entire global community. No single nation, even the US, can ensure the non-proliferation of ASI. Leopold suggests that hope for some sort of international ASI treaty is fanciful. He refers to the failure of climate treaties in support of this point, to which I'd add the years-long difficult negotiations on the pandemic treaty. Although he goes on to say that the main and perhaps only hope is an alliance of democracies, he still sees America in the lead. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, and I don't mean the Republican Party symbol. If the US does take the lead on controlling the proliferation of ASI, do we trust it to get it right? The very nation where AI lab security is described in the article as worse than random defense contractors making bolts. A made in America solution is not the answer. A broader global framework is essential to prevent proliferation of ASI and to curb the impulse for dangerous competition. Rather than placing the burden on American leadership, regardless of the administration, what we need instead are democracies united under a common goal to avoid an ASI arms race that ends in chaos and self-destruction. Oh, and we also need to solve antimicrobial resistance, and the clock's ticking on both.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lesley-Anne. Next up, Betsy, and then Janice, and then we'll turn to Leo for his reactions.
I'll try to go quickly here. I think I'm going to take on some of the assumptions and implicit assumptions in this question. I think US leadership on AI policy in general is to be desired. Anyone who believes in this statement desires this because of the United States' roots and democratic values. And we could debate whether the United States is living up to those values, but that's a topic for a different day. The democratic values we all aspire towards are that every person, their opinions matter, that they have agency. And I think there are two things here to highlight as they relate to the notion of a non-proliferation regime for AI. The first is that if you believe the trend lines, and that is the implicit assumption in this statement, is that we believe the trend lines AGI is coming in the next 10 years. If you believe those and you value the democratic values, the single most important thing you could possibly be doing today is working to reform economic policies so that AI does not just enrich the technologists and engineers and folks on this call who are adjacent to the industry, but generates a broad base of economic success for all of humanity. Without that, democratic values are all going to be lost out the gate, and non-proliferation is frankly besides the point. The second point I would make here is that non-proliferation is a term that harkens back to nuclear weapons, and that is inherently a bad analogy for where we stand with AI at this point in time. US leadership in AI, to the extent that it's been achieved to date, has been achieved through the free market activity that the US fosters and encourages, frankly, in the technology sector. Which is quite the opposite of what was happening with nuclear weapons development leading up to the non-proliferation agreements, when a bunch of what was at that time effectively academic research was nationalized, classified, and locked up. Today, AI is a privatized technology. It is already actively deployed and in widespread use across a range of different industries. Nationalizing that would be antithetical to the free market values that have generated US leadership in this space to begin with. And so I would argue instead of non-proliferation, what we should be talking about is a robust governance framework, that would be a better frame for thinking about how we mitigate, manage, and prepare for the risks of an eventual AGI future.
I am much more cynical than either of my two predecessors. Let me say, I think there is zero chance of any kind of non-proliferation regime, not only through the United States and through American leadership, but through a grouping of democracies. I don't believe that that is a realistic path to get to a goal that I think is wrongly specified, okay? So 2 comments here. One, what's missing from this whole discussion is the intense and acute race that is going on between China and the United States, which is the scaffolding and the architecture of this. It's very nice to talk about democratic values, but let me tell you, that's not what the United States is concerned about when it watches to the best of its ability what is going on in China. The only chance for self-imposed limits or even agreed upon limits is if American leaders come to the view that China is on the verge of a breakthrough. That is the only chance. How good is our understanding of where China is? I have a lot of reservations that we in fact have a line of sight into that. And so we're dealing in an area of real uncertainty. Secondly, non-proliferation is the wrong model here, but I'm no more optimistic about governance. I think Betsy's exactly right. Non-proliferation worked when it was exclusively an interstate issue. And it came quite late. It didn't come until 1968. And by the way, it's failed because the agreement was concluded among 5 nuclear powers. We now have 10 going on 12. And in fact, we're seeing a breakdown of non-proliferation. And so I think it's entirely the wrong goal. We will have to get very, very close to a very, very serious crisis before government leaders come together. And the last point I want to make here is of all the regulators in the world, the United States is the lead in laggardness. China has its own robust regime of regulation that is based in profoundly non-democratic values, and the European Union does nothing much in this field except export regulation. So the United States is not a player in any regulation market. It's not a serious player, in part because it's got the leading companies in the world and has no incentive to regulate and slow down. So Leopold, I'm afraid that if you're going to look for regulation, you have to look for self-regulation by the people adjacent to the sector and the kind of people that are on this call.